Hello. I want to show you how to mark up the text using Microsoft Word. If you want to mark the text, the first thing you need to know is what are you marking? Why are you marking it? And how you'll find that information as you go to the very end, past the stories they want you to read, and you find the questions. Some of the questions are going to be explanatory, and they will use the word explain. Some of the questions will be opinion questions, and you'll see stuff like feel or think, and they want to know what you feel or think. So depending on what the question is, you mark the text differently. So let's start with explain how these two fairy tales follow normal fairy tale patterns. Cite, which means tell examples from the stories to support your response. So I'm even going to underline some stuff in the actual question so I know what I'm looking for. Click underline. Normal fairy tale patterns. Once upon a time, happily ever after, evil stepmother, stuff like that. I'm underlining sections in this story that follow those patterns so that when I go to write the essay, I know what I'm looking at. So let's go back to the top. We got Rumpelstiltskin. Once there was a miller who was poor. Underlining that or highlighting that. I could do that too. He's got struggles. A lot of times in fairy tales, they have struggles. But he had a beautiful daughter, and we've seen that before, so we're going to highlight that. Beautiful daughter. Now it happened that he had to go and speak to the king. A lot of time you're dealing with royalty in fairy tales, so I'm highlighting that. And in order to make himself appear important, he said to him, I have a daughter who can spin straw into gold. The king said to the miller that is an art which pleases me well. If your daughter is as clever as you say, bring her tomorrow to my palace, underlining that or highlighting it, and I will put her to the test. And when the girl was brought to him, he took her into a room which was quite full of straw, gave her a spinning wheel and reel, and said, now set to work. And if by tomorrow morning early you have not spun this straw into gold during the night, you must die. So there's a problem. Every fairy tale has a problem. So she's got this challenge she's got to face. Thereupon he himself locked up in the room and left her in it alone. So there sat the poor miller's daughter, and for the life of her could not tell what to do. She had no idea how straw could be spun into gold, and she grew more and more frightened. Frightened's a good one. A lot of times you'll see frightened stuff. And she began to weep. The language, the vocabulary they use in fairy tales too, the word weep rather than cry. So we're going to fast forward. The rest of the story, you would do the same thing. Look for things that you always see in fairy tales. There's onomatopoeia, where they use words that mean sounds. You highlight everything because the question, remember, if you go to the bottom, says explain how these two fairy tales follow normal fairy tale patterns. So when we read, we underline things that we see as patterns in fairy tales. Let's skip to Snow White real quick. There once was a poor, you see how we did that? Widow who lived in a lonely cottage. So she's in the woods. A lot of times these things happen in the wood or palace. In front of the cottage was a garden wherein stood 2 rose trees, one of which bore white and the other red roses. She had 2 children who were like the 2 rose trees, and one was called Snow White, and the other was Rose Red. They were as good and happy, as busy and cheerful as ever 2 children in the world were. Only Snow White was more quiet and gentle than Rose Red. Rose Red liked better to run about in the meadows and fields. I'm highlighting that. Just the setting. A lot of times you'll see stuff like that, the setting be in the meadow, seeking flowers and catching butterflies. But Snow White sat at home with her mother and helped her with housework or read to her when there was nothing to do. The 2 children were so fond of one another that they always held each other by the hand when they went out together. And when Snow White said, we will not leave each other, Rose Red answered, never so long as we live. And their mother would add, what one has, she must share with the other. They often ran about the forest. The setting is very similar in most stories, most fairy tale stories. Alone and gathered red berries. and no beasts did them any harm, but came close to them trustfully. The little hare would eat a cabbage leaf out of their hands. The roe grazed by their side. The stag leapt merrily by them. So I'm gonna really highlight a lot of this because this happens quite a bit in fairy tales where they animals kind of act abnormally or like extra friendly. No mishap ever overtook them. If they had stayed too long or too late in the forest and night came on, they laid themselves down near one another upon the moss and slept until morning came, and their mother knew this and did not worry on their account. So the way people behave is different in a fairy tale. Like if you stayed out in the forest all night, your mom would not act like that, and that's something you can talk about in your essay response. Once when they spent the night in the wood, and the dawn had roused them, they saw a beautiful child in the shining white dress sitting near their bed. He got up and looked quite kindly at them, but said nothing and went away into the forest. And when they looked around, they found that they had been sleeping quite close to the precipice. Uh-oh, this sounds like a problem. Quite close to the precipice, and would certainly have fallen into it in the darkness if they had gone only a few paces further. And their mother told them that it must have been the angel who watches the good children. Snow White and Rose Red kept their mother's little cottage so neat that it was a pleasure to look inside. In the summer, Rose Red took care of the house, and every morning laid a wreath of flowers by her mother's bed before she awoke, in which was a rose from each tree. In the winter, Snow White lit the fire and hung the kettle on the hob. The kettle was of brass and shone like gold, so brightly when it polished. In the evening, when snowflakes fell, the mother said, "Go, Snow White, and bolt the door." And then they sat round the hearth, and the mother took her spectacles and read aloud out of the large book. And the two girls listened, and they sat and spun, because didn't they spin in the last one? Spin gold. And close by them they lay a lamb upon the floor, and behind them a perch set, a white dove with its head hidden beneath its wings. One evening, as they were thus sitting comfortably together, someone knocked at the door as if he wished to be let in. The mother said, "Quick, Rose Red, open the door. It must be a traveler who is seeking shelter." Yikes. We wouldn't assume that necessarily if we had someone at our door. So that's kind of fairy tale behavior. Rose Red went and pushed back the bolt, thinking that it was a poor man, but it was not. It was a bear that stretched his broad black head within the door. So being in the forest presents new problems that you don't have if you're set like in the city. Rose Red screamed and sprang back. The lamb bleated, the dove fluttered, and Snow White hid herself behind the mother's bed. I didn't copy the whole story onto here, but do you see how I'm copying parts of the fairy tale to explain fairy tales normally go like this? They're normally set here. They normally talk like this. If you were answering an opinion question, you would do it differently and highlight different things. I'll make one more video showing you how to highlight stuff for an opinion question next, but good luck.